Welcome to the Holding All the Cards podcast. My name's Daniel. I go by Kiramode on the forums. And I just finished watching the presidential debate. We're going to talk about a shit show. But, that's America. In any case, we're not here to talk about politics or who has a better chance to run our country. We're talking about something that's more important to me and probably more important to the people that are watching this, which is Star Wars. And we're here to talk about today's topic is tournament game theory. Now, tournament game theory, it's not Star Wars specific, but I'm going to use a lot of examples regarding our card games, so I'll go into that. Also, for reference, I'm a huge basketball fan, so a lot of the analogies I make are basketball related. So I'll use one of my analogies that I like to use a lot with hoops and cards, and it's because in basketball you have 5 players, and in this game you typically have 5 pods you play. Like most people, when they go to a tournament and they build a deck, a lot of times you build a deck that has 5 pods, each ran as 2 ofs. So I think it's like an easy way to think about it. So in hoops, you always have to figure out whether you're in a situation where you need to run your 5 best guys or whether you need to run the 5 guys you trust. So sometimes you'll be in a situation where there's 5 players that are clearly better. All 5 of them are substantially better than the 6th best player. In which case, it doesn't matter what the matchup is. It doesn't matter whether a guy's been struggling. It doesn't matter in terms of chemistry of the players. You just got to run the 5 best guys. There's no choice there. But usually, the difference between the 4th best player and the 5th best player and the 6th best player and the 7th best player, there's a difference, but it's not huge. And what it really comes down to, if you're going to try to win, is you need to find the 5 guys you trust, the 5 guys that are hot, the 5 guys that click together, the 5 guys that match up better with your opponent. So, reeling it back to Star Wars, I think a lot of times you're in that situation where you need to figure out, are we in a 5 best pod meta, or are we in a 5 pods you trust meta? So, for example, not too long ago, we were in a 5 best pods meta, and it was, you play Endor Entrapment, you play Deploy the Fleet, you play Yularen, you play Tarkin, you play Chimera. And those were the 5 best pods. And really playing anything else on Dark Side, you could still win, and you know what, you'll probably be favored to win. But you're really putting yourself at a handicap. You're spotting your opponent points, effectively, by playing anything but those 5 pods all ran as 2 ofs. But that's the exception, that's not the rule. We're not always in a 5 best pod meta. Most of the time, we're in a 5 pod you trust meta, which means that the best decision to make in terms of decks is completely based on what's happening in the meta, what you feel comfortable with, what you have experience playing with, and which decks fit your playstyle. Now, right now, we have a ton of diversity in the meta on both sides. Dark side more than light side. Like dark side, every faction can be played as a mono faction, and you can realistically pump out 2 good Sith decks. You could probably pump out 1.5 good Scum decks. You can pump out 2 to 3 Navy decks that are all varying levels of competitive. And when I say decks, I mean like there's a difference of at least more than 4 pods, right? So a deck that goes Tarkin, Yularen, Chimera, and then the 2 different decks vary only on the other 4 pods. Those aren't different decks. Those are the same decks with slight variations. To me, a different deck is like if there's a 7 pod difference, an 8 pod difference. That's why I think on light side there's way more diversity than people give it credit for. Yeah, Yoda shows up in a lot of stuff, but if I can build 4 different decks with Yoda and none of the decks share any pods, then that's diversity. You can build Yoda plus a bunch of red cards that are Commando. You can build Mono Jedi, really 2 different Mono Jedi decks if you wanted to, and it wouldn't be that hard to do it. And you can build a Jedi deck that has Jedi plus Smugglers. Like it's really easy to build those. You can also build a Capital Ship deck. Fighter decks are borderline, but still pretty good. And Smugglers, once Zeb comes out, I think, like I've been running a couple of those decks. I don't know if they're quite there in terms of being able to run this monocolor, But they're getting closer to being able to not need to use Yoda. Like I think the Zed Pod allows you to play more of a not a fortress smugglers, but you can run targeted strike decks now. Like that's gonna be a thing once that pod drops on Thursday. So when you go to a tournament, the question is, well, what do you run? And I think a lot of it just has to do again with primarily, what do you feel comfortable with, and what does the meta have? So if the meta is overrun by Navy, and there's nothing but Navy decks running around, then the best deck to run would be either Owen Jedi decks or Rebel Commando decks, because both of those decks pack enough redirect effects that it'll enable you to be able to work around Tarkin Doctrine and turn off Enforced Loyalty and pump out damage faster than you want and can send it back. Now, let's say, the deck on the light side, let's say there's a lot of Rebel Commando decks running around, or a lot of aggressive Owen builds. Well, now your core Sith build decks, your burn decks, your decks that are just nothing but direct damage from Sith, those become more valuable. Well, if those become more valuable, now Control Jedi decks become more valuable because Q-Ron just puts the kibosh on really any sort of direct damage deck. But if those decks become more popular, then aggressive Scum decks or aggressive Navy decks, like non-Fortress style decks, those become more valuable. And there's always different decks that can counter other decks. So you have to know that first, right? And if the meta you expect it to be diverse overall, if you don't expect one deck to just run over everything from one side, then it comes back to you. Then it comes back to, okay, well, what do I feel most comfortable with? Because some people, their play styles have certain habits. So there's some people that like to attack every turn. And if you like to attack every turn, you can't play a control deck. You can't play any Leia Jedi decks. You can't play any sort of Fortress Navy decks. So those are just non-options. Because if the deck requires you to sit back a lot and you want to attack, you're being counterproductive. By that same token, if you're a really conservative player and you don't like the thought of losing edge battles, you don't like the thought of somebody drawing into the nuts and counterattacking and screwing you over, then maybe you shouldn't play aggressive decks. Maybe you shouldn't play Scum. Maybe you shouldn't play aggressive light side decks. You should be leaning more towards decks that can sit back, decks that can hold the force, decks that can largely win off of their board as opposed to their tricks and their aggression. Now, personally, I think one of the biggest mistakes people make when they play is I think people don't mulligan enough. I think people are way too conservative. Just people like play, like either on Skype or on Lackey or in person. I see people that just are allergic to mulligan, and there's not necessarily a bad thing. I just think that that's a tendency that people have, and I think it's a wrong tendency, but that's just my opinion. But let's say you don't like mulligan. Let's say you're more afraid of drawing a bad hand than you are optimistic about drawing a better hand when you get a kind of questionable opening hand. Like if your opening hand on, say, Dark Side is something like, I don't know, let's say you're playing Sith and it's a Kawadi security team, a resource, and an advisor. That's a pretty weak hand. Like that's a hand that you probably should mulligan, but there's some people that say, hey, I got 2 resources, I'll keep it. And then there's other people that say, I can do better. And on light side, I think the equivalent of that is you have an opening hand that's Luke and no resource. Your deck should be able to get you better than Luke plus no resource. That's a weak hand. But some people just don't like to mulligan. So I think if you don't like to mulligan and it's just something that you're afraid of, then there's certain types of decks that you should just stay away from, like forever. First would be any sort of combo deck. Any sort of deck that requires that you carefully select what your opening hands are, you just stay away from them. In other words, fighter decks are just off the table. Both light side and dark side fighter decks. So those decks, they're highly dependent on how you play your first 2 turns, and you can't be running suboptimal hands. That's the biggest mistake I see people make when they play dark side fighter decks, and it's that if your opening turn as a fighter deck is a 181st and what's the name of the dude? The pilot that gives everyone elite fell. If your opening turn is a 181st fell, no resource, that's such a bad opening, because like you have no tactics, you can't kill anything. Sure, you take the force, but you're not really advancing the game plan. Like, why would you ever take that hand over a hand where you could play a pilot ready room plus the ship plus maybe another ship and then play fell with a stay on target, or find a way to discount it in? Or if you have what's it called, guarding the wing out there, your opening turn you should be looking for as many black squadron units as you can to pump out 3 to 4 cards on your opening turn. Just plain fell to take the force is just bad. Like, that's not what the deck wants to do. And Rebel Fighters are the same way. Like, why would you accept any hand that doesn't have a Rogue Squadron X-Wing? That's a bad hand. Like, there's no excuse for that. If you mulligan into, you get back-to-back bad hands, well, okay, well then sure, that's fine. Then you just got hosed, work with what you got. But if you have a suboptimal hand in the combo deck, and then you choose to keep it, you can't blame luck, right? You're making your own bad luck at that point. So you stay away from those decks. Also, probably stay away from any deck that requires that you get a turn 1 resource. So, for example, if you're running any of the Sith Vaders, and you're not running a double resource objective, which happens a lot, you need that turn 1 resource fast, and especially because you're probably running Palpatine too. So if you're running a deck that requires a lot of really expensive units, then you're gonna have to mulligan. If you get an opening hand that has no resources, you can't play that hand. You have to mulligan. And if mulligan carries the risk that you might not draw a unit, then you might not draw a unit. But if you keep a hand that doesn't have a resource, you're setting yourself up for failure, and you can't do that in the opening flop. So maybe don't play that deck. Maybe you play Scum, because Scum, it's really hard to have a bad opening hand. Between Caesar's objective and Spice Trade, you're at least 85% to hit a double resource objective in your opening flop, which means that you're going to be able to play any sort of unit that you draw. The Chuds and Scum are really efficient. You have a lot of really solid openings. So like where Sith Chuds are really bad and easy to kill and have very little tactics, Scums are actually pretty solid in terms of what they do. So a Scum deck, you can get 2 Chuds, maybe a resource, maybe not a resource, and it's an acceptable turn. It's like, okay, well, I can work with this. So maybe you would play Scum in that situation. Navy, if you don't like to mulligan, then don't play the Executor. The Executor leads to dead hands because he costs 6 mana. Like, he's going to hurt your consistency of your deck. You're going to have dead draws. The only way to combat that is you need to be aggressive with the mulligan to be able to get it in there. But if you don't like mulligans, okay, that's fine. Don't play the Executor. Play Zed instead, right? Get a 3 cost guy that you can drop into play. Just be a little more conservative in the types of units. Going to light side, if you don't like mulligans, again, Rebel Fighters, off the table. Capital Ships, off the table. They're done. Both of those decks are no longer in discussion for you. If you want to play any sort of Falcon deck, those are probably also off the table, because most Falcon decks don't run a lot of double resource objectives. Maybe you run Luke, like Core Luke, and that's it. So you're probably not going to be able to deploy Falcon turn 1, which means you're going to have a resource turn 1, and it's much harder to get resources on light side than it is on dark side. So to get the resource, you're going to have to probably mulligan into it. You're probably going to have to do hard mulligans for resources, because the last thing you want is to be turn 1 no resource, draw again, you don't have a resource. Turn 3 you draw Falcon, can't play him. That's a really, really bad place to be in as a player, and it's best not to take that chance. So at that point, if you don't feel confident doing that, don't play that. If if you don't like the mulligans, probably don't want to play the Moldy Crow. Because the Moldy Crow, again, a lot of dead hands that creates. And I've seen people, when I've played against them, I'll play as dark side, they'll play as light side. I see them deploy turn 1 Rusons, which is terrible. You should never, ever, ever do that. And worse, they kept their hand, and they kept it because they had the resource, they had the elite resource, and they'd have like a Ruson and maybe one other card. And like, okay, well, this is a reasonable turn. It's like, no, it's not a reasonable turn. It's never reasonable to play a Ruson. Or I'll see people do turn 1 Moldy Crows. Moldy Crow is a mid-game card. It's only good if you can get them in there and you can get the unopposed. It's not good on the opening turn, especially if you're building that opening turn and you can't realistically win an edge battle. It becomes a liability, especially because Moldy Crow can't kill anything, can't tap anything. He can just take damage and die. It's not worth the effort to play in turn 1. So you can't accept Moldy Crow opening turns. You have to mulligan on that. So the types of decks you should be playing are decks where everyone costs 4 or less, and decks that have a lot of resources, so, or that don't need the resources. So if you run, say, what's it called? If you run a deck that runs on a lot of 3-drops, take for example your this is going back a little bit, but like your Ron, Leia, Yoda decks. Those decks typically had Leia and they had Yoda, and then they'd either have Ron or they have Guardians for like more control style Jedi. Those decks, it's kind of hard to have a really, really bad opening hand because everyone's cheap, everyone's playable. You can usually play 2 cards at once, right? Or you can play more of like Owen builds. So if you run a deck like, say, Tom Malucci's Worlds deck, that deck ran 2 Yodas, 2 Rons, 2 Owens, 2 Endor Lukes, 1 Mystics, and 1 copy of Red 5. Everyone in there is 4 or less, so you'll never have an issue with playing your units. Owen discounts your units if you want to play multiple cards in the same turn. And most of the units in there are playable. The only unit that you really don't want to be playing early is Red 5. Red 5 is one of those cards that you want to be playing mid-game. But it makes it so Yoda's playable turn 1, Luke's playable turn 1. You can build your resources early if you wanted to, because that's what Sulon Sympathizer is really good at. They allow you to put a unit on the board and play him for a net 1 mana. And you can just keep pushing damage through because you'll have Owen's objective that gives you extra cards, so that way you won't be afraid to attack. Really, people will be afraid to block you because they know you can auto-win any edge battle that you really, really want to win. So that would be an example of the type of deck that you could run where it'd be safer. Another type of safe deck, I think, would be if you ran one of those Rebel Commando decks, because those decks, Han costs 4, Durlin costs 3, Yoda costs 3, Crix costs 4, but he gives you 3 resources. You can play Crix plus a guy, and then just refresh him with May the Force be with you. Judder only costs 3. So that deck, even though it doesn't have a lot of resources, because it runs on such a low resource curve, and the chuds are pretty cheap, like Han's chuds are 1 mana, a Nudge is 0 mana, and then Judder's guys are 2, but they give you a card back, so you can at least continue forward with your good edge hands. Those kind of decks are they're safer with regards to your opening hand. They're more consistent. You don't have to mulligan. You don't have to be scared to, draw and then not draw anything useful. Or worse, I know everyone's had this where they have a hand, they can't play it, it's just terrible. You mulligan, you draw up your hand, and you have Obi-Wan, and you can't play him. And it's terrible. It sucks, but sometimes that happens. So building decks in ways where that's not going to happen. Building decks that don't have 5 drops, they don't have 6 drops. Or if they do have that, to have an abundance. Not 1 or 2, but more like 3 or 4 double resource objectives. That will allow you to not worry about resources, and it allows you to always, or for the most part, keep your opening hands. Like you'd only have to mulligan the worst of hands that you'd get. Now, the last part on this is just practice. So, like I went over what I think is the biggest tendency that people have, and what should determine their decks is just do you mulligan, right? If you like to mulligan, you can play riskier decks. If you don't like to mulligan, you need to play much more conservative decks with regards to your resource curve. But there's another aspect of this too, which is just practice. So I think if you're going to a tournament, the deck that you should pick is whatever deck you know the best, whatever deck you know like the back of your hand, whichever deck you can confidently know what you're digging for. Because that's the problem. Like I think a lot of people, like I've seen this happen where I'll go to a tournament and someone will say, oh, I just saw this, I just built this deck, or I wanted to try this deck out, or I heard this deck was good, I want to see what it can do. And the problem with that is you're not going to get a good representation of how well a deck can do until you've played it 3 to 4 times. And the biggest reason for that is that you don't know how to play the deck yet. It's not until you've actually ran it a couple times, seen what the draws look like, see what interactions are available with the cards, that you're going to be able to make good decisions as to what to do with the deck, which cards to discard at the start of your draw phase, which cards to dump an edge, which cards to deploy, which cards to avoid deploying. And if those decisions aren't being made ahead of time, if you're not getting that practice ahead of time, then you're not going to really know how to play the deck, and the deck's probably going to perform poorly. Whereas let's say you take a deck that you don't love, right? Like you have doubts about it, but you at least know it. You at least know how it works. You at least know what you're drawing for. You at least know what the win conditions are. Then you're going to perform a little better than expected just because you know how to confidently play your own deck. And that right there is probably the most valuable thing. I mean, this goes straight into the mulligan thing. And it's just, what are you trying to do? Do you know what the plan is? Do you know what the plan is with your draws? Do you know what the plan is with your deployment? Do you know what the plan is with your attacks? Do you know what your plan is with the force? If you know all that stuff ahead of time, that with whatever deck it is, that deck is inevitably going to perform better than a deck that you don't know what you're doing with, than a deck that you haven't tried with before, than a deck that you've made last minute substitutions to. I think a perfect example of this is last year at Worlds. Look, the guys that got first and the guy that got second, neither one of them were confident with their decks going in. Tom changed his dark side deck the night before because he thought, I don't like Navy. I don't feel confident in it. I don't like it. I'm a Sith player. I'm just going to play my Sith deck. And he won the tournament. Meanwhile, David on the other side, he had a deck that he'd been running for a while. He's running the Jedi deck that abuses the card draw from Obi-Wan's objective, from core Obi-Wan's objective. And going into the tournament, where we told the story that he didn't like the deck. He didn't want to play. He wanted to change it. And ultimately, what happened is he just didn't have extra cards. Like, he was going to build another deck, but he didn't have the cards with him. He's like, all right, I guess I'm just going to roll with the deck that I built initially and that I've been practicing with. And he got to second place. So I think that goes to show the value of continuity. Just knowing the deck, practicing with it over and over and over again ahead of time, that'll improve performance once you're actually there. If you use a tournament as a stomping grounds, you're not going to get the results you want. But if you practice ahead of time and you just know what you're trying to do, you'll be better. And to be clear, what I'm talking about here is I'm talking about tournaments that you're trying to win. I'm not talking about like you're just random Friday night or a store championship or something like that. I'm talking about like you're going to a regional or something. So like, for example, me and my playtest partner, Bad Mojo Jojo, in a lot of games we're very similar. In this game we're very different in how we play. So the light side deck and the dark side deck that we're both going to play is almost certain to be it's almost certain to be completely different. Now we went to a regional not too long ago, back in the Endor Entrapment Dark days, we ended up running the same decks. And the reason was we had no choice but to run the dark side deck that we ran. And then for light side, he couldn't think of any ideas. I had a deck that I didn't love, but I thought it gave the best chance. And the reason it was one of my Kraken decks, and the reason I liked it was I said, okay, well, you know what? I can build the deck if I hit the right flop and I hit the right draws and Tarkin doesn't show up early. I can shove 8 cards captured under Endor Entrapment and just one-shot that thing. And then at that point, you can't discard a card to get rid of it. Of course, I need a lot of things to go my way for that to happen, but that's, the decisions you make when you're up against Endor Entrapment. Like, it's just a lot of bad decisions. You got a lot of prayers involved if you want to win. So that was a deck I chose, and he couldn't think of it. He's like, all right, sure, I'll run that deck too. But make no mistake, when it comes to Worlds, we're in a much better place in the meta, and there's a lot of options on both sides. And I'll be running my decks that I feel comfortable with, and he'll be running the decks he feels comfortable with. And it's not that my decks are better than his decks or his decks are better than my decks. It's just that our decks are going to complement our own play styles and what we try to do when we play, and that allow for our tendencies to be rewarded. And that's what everyone else should do. Everyone else should be looking to find a deck that fits them. Find a deck that they enjoy playing, that has good chemistry with them, because there is no such thing as a best deck right now. Right now, there's too much diversity for there to be one deck. There's too many answers to every single possible deck, that if you want to beat something, you can beat it. It's just what happens if, in trying to beat one particular deck, every other deck can just run the table with you. So that's all I had to say about that. It's just a little bit of game theory, and hope y'all enjoy the show.